100 people on the call here, so that's a good starting point for folks. I know we'll have some folks coming in as we continue. So welcome everyone to Let's Get Technical call. We had a break last week, so it feels like a long time since we've been together, but I'm excited to be back sort of in the saddle here again with the call, and we're excited today particularly to have Stefan Konya and Patrick Murtha here talking about FAST and how that fits into the overall architecture and structure of integrated health and human services. So we'll dive into that in just a moment or so. But I wanted to just say a few words before we get started. I think it's almost redundant at this point to talk about virtual Zoom housekeeping, but for those of you who may have just crawled out from under a rock, please, sort of manage your mutes as appropriate. I think we usually encourage video, but just in the spirit of bandwidth conservation, I think it's probably good not to do that today. We keep hearing folks are having some challenges with that. Of course, we have all the usual features. So if you find if you're new to Zoom for any reason, there's a navigation bar either at the bottom or the top. There's a chat function. You can raise your hand. We'll have some conversation today during and then after the presentation, and we do try to certainly make sure that we get started and we have okay. Mike, you may want to turn the recording on. I was just going to say we do record these calls, and all of them, since we started doing these back in August, are on the website, which is for those of you who've gone through all your Netflix and Amazon favorites, you can this weekend sort of binge watch all of the Let's Get Technical calls. I might say, as we do get started, that we have had a whole variety of them on, so including some of them that sort of contribute to the larger understanding of today's presentation as well. And so those will be posted on the hub. You see the URL down there below, and hopefully you'll have all joined to become members of the NIC. So I'm going to just go through a couple of slides before we dive into the presentation. We want to maximize the time for that. Usually we do introductions, but there's a lot of content today, so I think that we're gonna bypass that today. As you come on, though, feel free to add, kind of where you're from in the chat box and kind of what your role is, and we'll kind of see who's on the call. We always get a sort of a different crowd of folks. Each of the presentations attracts different folks, so that's a good thing. And as I said earlier, we'll be talking about FAST and the barriers and solutions for adopting FHIR moving forward with Stefan and Patrick. So next slide, Mike, please. We do have a series of webinars which we are scheduled now through actually almost the end of May. There are a couple of them are identified here, and of course you'll see those on the website. And if you sign up at the NIC, you'll get yet more email into your email box. I'm sure that's something everybody's looking forward to. But we will keep you posted on what's happening. And there's some really interesting different things that we'll be talking about here. And I'll call more attention to that. Although one thing I want to do call out is on just a couple things. One is next week we have the Wellbeing in the Network, which is a great collaborative looking at metrics and measures, national ones. Was formerly part of something called 100 Million Healthier Lives. Some of us, Saha, will be leading that. And then we're doing something a little unique with, unfortunately the State Health IT Connect Summit was canceled like many other summits. So we're actually partnering with them to host Interoperability Insights, which will actually be a kind of a nice follow-on to this, because we'll be featuring Gravity, Da Vinci, Karen Alliance, and Project Unify on that. So it'll be a conversation with each of those, introducing those and kind of wrapping it together, hopefully, in terms of how those things will be integrated, along with some presentations about COVID from Indiana. And then we'll come back the week after that with a presentation from the Agents for Healthcare Research and Evaluation from ARC, looking at back to that other little pesky issue of opioids and some of the real innovative work that they're doing around that, some of the research. And so that should be really also insightful. So if you proceed, Mike, next slide there. Thank you. Welcome everybody who's putting their names in there. Yeah, so just a minute on this. I know I can see from the participants, there's some new folks on the call today. And just a kind of what the background of these calls come from. It's something that we've been fortunate enough to be able to develop over the last number of years, which is called the National Interoperability Collaborative. We kind of affectionately refer to it as a community of networks. And what we do is we recognize that there are multiple domains providing different and related services, from human services, public health, education, public safety, emergency medical response, healthcare, and IT. And then many of them have commonalities in terms of the challenges and problems we're trying to solve. And so what we've been trying to do is trying to bring them together in this forum as well as the online forum to facilitate more cross-domain conversation and communication. Clearly in the current environment with COVID-19 and certainly with other crises, both man-made and natural, the need for being able to share information and data across those domains is paramount and critical. And as we had the opportunity to dive into that through some work we did with HIMSS, we discovered that in fact there are a lot of parallels as we look at those. And so there's a paper off to the right side there for those of you maybe familiar with it, not familiar with it. It kind of goes in and sets up each of those domains, begins to look at the strategies, the opportunities, challenges, and technologies that each are focusing on. Our goal is to try to facilitate more of that cross-domain conversation. And we really have to thank the Kresge Foundation for supporting this work the last couple of years. And as a national foundation, they really understand the need for that kind of integration and interoperability. So I encourage you to look at that more. And next slide. Yes. So the last slide before I introduce Stefan and Patrick. So one of the things we're doing as the stewards of change and the National Interoperability Collaborative is to think about, particularly given where we are right now and the challenges that we're focused on, and the ones that we don't even know what the challenges are will be over the next couple of months, is trying to bring together thought leaders and subject matter experts from across those different domains that I just mentioned to develop something called the National Action Agenda. And over the next 9 months, we'll be convening folks from across those domains to really think about developing a roadmap, an actionable roadmap about what do we go do next to lead and to support and to accelerate cross-domain interoperability. It's really focused on social determinants. What happens down the road, or as Wayne Gretzky, sort of refers to, where is the puck going? I know so many people and organizations are very focused on addressing the issues right now, as they should be, and as we all should be making sure we're supporting that effort. We also need to create a little bandwidth to think about where are we going to be at in a year, and so that we don't end up asking those questions, but we're tracking it going forward, and we have some very specific ideas about what would help us, unfortunately, take advantage of this crisis to guide the kinds of changes many people on this call have been thinking about and talking about for a long, long time. And so I invite you to join in that action agenda. We're keeping it open to folks. We'll be having a series of webinars to continue to talk about it, to develop the agenda for that. And then there'll be actually an in-person convening at Stanford Center for Population Health Sciences. And we're hoping by January 2021 that people will be actually cavorting together in physical space. So stay tuned to that. And as I said, please join us as we go forward. So next slide, Mike. And that's the URL for folks to join the community if you haven't seen it already. And Sundays, who is managing the group chat here, will certainly put that up. It's already there. So that gives us really the opportunity to move in really into the presentation here. And I've been excited about this as we have been hosting various conversations. As I said, we've had Da Vinci and Gravity and the Caring Alliance and others on the healthcare side here. And FAST certainly, if not completes it, certainly does provide a really good opportunity for us to understand how a lot of those pieces come together from the accelerator world. So we're really excited about having this call today and being able to present and understand that. As we were developing and preparing for this, both with Patrick and Melissa and with Stefan, who mentioned in a moment, has some background with us. A lot of people from this community are from the human services side and don't fully understand all of the activity and all of the action that's happening on the healthcare and the IT side. So it's exciting to be able to bring those worlds together to show what is happening and how we can learn and leverage from that universe, ideally into the human services world and some of the other domains. So next slide. So our two presenters are, all of you probably are quite familiar with Stefan and Patrick. I've had the great fortune, and some other members of Stewards have, of knowing Stefan from before ONC days. Actually worked with us some at Stewards of Change on some of the human services work we've done, and previously in Illinois. So it's a great privilege and honor, and it's so great to see Stefan continuing to sort of drive the puck forward, as it might be. And so we welcome you, Stefan, today, and really excited to hear some of your exploits and activities. And Patrick, new to meeting you, but everything I've learned and read about you, just really driving the FAST initiative. It's really exciting to have you spend some time with us today, given the schedule, to really share from an architectural perspective where this is going and how we might be able to leverage it. So with that, Stefan, hand the microphone over to you there.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And thank you for the introduction. It's exciting to get a chance to spend some time working with the team at Stewards of Change again. I've always, been impressed with the work that you've done. Before I worked with you guys, and since then, and glad to see you guys are carrying the torch as well on around interoperability of these worlds. So you heard a brief introduction about myself. I work for the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT within the Secretary's office at HHS. And today we're going to focus on the FHIR Scale Task Force. You heard a little bit about, which is something that ONC plays a lead convening role for. And I'll get into a little more detail on why. And then you also heard a great introduction on Patrick Murda, a colleague of mine who I'm honored to get to work beside. He's been great for making sure that Humana as an organization has been involved in this work, but we're really lucky that he is the individual on behalf of that organization that's been playing such a vital role, volunteering his time to our effort. And the amount of hours that he gives up and puts in during work and after work hours towards this effort is just truly a testament to his commitment to this area. So we're going to start off, though, now that you know a little bit about us, we want to know a little bit more about you. And this will help us afterwards be able to kind of track and see some of the questions that you might have and get a sense of who our audience is. So first, let's go ahead and launch the first poll. We're just going to have a couple of those during this presentation. The first question is really, what type of organization do you represent? And I think we're going to go ahead and launch that poll. There we go. So are you a clinician? And that can be really any type of clinician, physician, nurse, PA, et cetera. Do you work in clinical operations, clinical technical staff? Do you work for an EHR vendor or some type of other health IT interoperability vendor? Do you work for a clearinghouse, a health information exchange, HIE, state or regional based? Or do you work in the area of population health? And if for some reason you don't fit one of those categories, feel free to do, and I think there's actually some other options if you scroll down. So I know I have a confidence monitor here, and it doesn't show that you can scroll down, but if you scroll down, there's also other options of academia, human service organizations. And if you don't fit any of those categories, for some reason we didn't have a bucket, feel free to just put that in the chat and say, I represent this type of organization. So we'll give it some time to get a good level of response there. I see some are also clarifying their category. That's good as well. It's good to kind of get some additional context. So if you quasi fit in a category and you want a little extra color that you want to add to it, feel free to do that as well. Do you see a lot of payers? It's probably, considering we have a payer, and that's probably a good one that we missed. We probably should have that, but that's okay. And I think once we get to a certain percentage, I think Mike will go ahead and advance us onto the next slide. Okay, great. So do we get a chance to see the poll results live? There you go. Perfect. All right, so as you guys can see, we got a pretty broad representation, a couple in every category. Doesn't look like we had full response, but we're seeing a lot of HIE representation, a lot of human service organizations, academic, population health, and a number of interoperability vendors. So those who are in the interoperability vendor space, you might be more familiar with this work, the HIEs as well. And I assume that a lot on the human services side, some of this work might be a little bit new to you, or perhaps some of the sessions and the series that Daniel's been hosting lately around Da Vinci and others might have given you some primer to what we're going to cover today. But we're going to break it down and make it really easy no matter what level of understanding you have on this work. So whether you've been involved in this work and have a good understanding of FHIR, or whether you are new to it all, this would be a good place to start. So for today's agenda, we're going to do a high-level overview to start things off, just to let you know kind of the why behind FAST and kind of how we operate, so you get a little bit of sense on the structure. Then we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Patrick, who's going to take you into some basics about, API 101, what is FHIR, and why is FHIR adoption valuable, and the importance of infrastructure, which FAST is really all focused on, and we'll get into more details on that. He's going to take us through a patient journey as an example of the fast progress we're making and the solutions that we're trying to come up with to kind of break down a FHIR transaction step by step. So this will be a great kind of tutorial for you to have an understanding of it, and what are some of the solutions and barriers that we've identified and are working on. And then Patrick will turn it back over to myself, who will kind of talk about how this fits within ONC's broader goals to adopt health IT and support interoperability at scale. And then also a number of resources for follow-up. There's a lot of hyperlinks in this PowerPoint presentation, a lot of them. And so there's a lot of additional material that you can, click on and read and learn a lot more after this. The main purpose of this presentation is to give you a good understanding of what this is all about, and whet your appetite, if you will, and give you something that you will hopefully encourage you to learn a little more and get more involved. So with that, let's dive in. So what is FAST? Well, FAST is the FHIR at Scale Task Force initiative, which is led by ONC, convened by ONC as an independent, neutral government body, bringing together a lot of private sector payers, a lot of providers, third-party health IT vendors, consultants, others that are in the interoperability space, public health professionals, and others, to help identify and look at what are those barriers and challenges to scalability of FHIR solutions, and what solutions do we need to come up with to try to address those. So again, it's really bringing together that highly representative group of people who are motivated to do something about these challenges and barriers, and these experts in this industry. And ONC being a neutral party makes it possible. And the reason why is that many of these for-profit entities like Humana and other payers and some of the other vendors that are involved, some of the EHR vendors, et cetera, if they try to work on some of these solutions independently without a convener like ONC, they run the risk at running into problems with federal and state antitrust laws. And so it's really important that we've got a neutral party like ONC to bring them together, make it a fair, transparent, open process, and we don't get into any violation of antitrust. In fact, we go over an antitrust disclaimer at the beginning and end of all meetings, essentially reminding people they can't talk about IP or things that are in conflict with those laws. And again, we're really looking at those gaps as it relates to the scalability of solutions. We're going to get more into detail on what we mean by that. And looking at how we can address those barriers and really just accelerate FHIR adoption throughout the nation. Next slide. So just as a high-level timeline here, in our annual report, we've got a bit of an updated one as well that charts a little bit further into the future. But this is, in short, it's been about 2 years that we've been working on this. Everybody that's been involved is really on a volunteer basis, other than some contractors that we brought on early in 2019 to help facilitate some of the work. But essentially, this is all the expertise, subject matter expertise, and individuals that dedicate their time through a number of different structured meetings does that, on a volunteer basis. You could argue it's part of their job, and we do get cover from their leadership to do that. But it's been 2 years. We plan this to be about a 3-year endeavor at a minimum. We want to get the bulk of the work done in that 3-year period. So we're now entering that third year. But really, it spent a lot of time getting organized. We were methodical in making sure this was a well inclusive, thought out process, and we were getting it right from the start. We're bringing people along as we build this community. So as we're developing these solutions, we're not doing them in a vacuum, and we're also being transparent throughout that process, and making sure that a broader community, like the NIC community, for instance, can be aware of these things and ready to adopt them and deploy them once they're developed and published, and we don't have to do that education after the fact. There's a series of TLC webinars that we did starting at the end of last year. And the TLC is our technical learning community. I'm going to share more information on that in a second. And that's where we first shared kind of our draft version 1 of each of the solutions and walked through all of those and got some feedback from a broader public community. I encourage, if any of these solutions speak to you as we go through them, you could always go back and review those virtual webinars. And we'll be having updates to those draft solutions coming up here in the next few months. Next slide.
Stefan, this is Daniel. Let me just jump in for 1 second.
Yes.
I want to, just as I mentioned earlier on, there are a couple of, we want to sort of allow the presentation to go forward because it's very technical, but a couple of questions come up just for level setting. So one of the questions came up, which was, what's a Tiger team? And should we lock it in?
Yeah. Well, on the next slide, I'll cover that actually.
Right.
It's perfect timing. Nice segue. So as far as how we're structured in the organization of different ways that we get people engaged, volunteers to participate, essentially there's 3 key, there's 4 key kind of buckets of ways to get involved. On the left-hand side, you see kind of the official FAST membership, where we've both recruited and also others were nominated, and we selected them to be involved on a more consistent basis. They have regular standing meetings that are set kind of not in stone, but forecasted into the future, regularly scheduled. At the one that is the most active and meets the most regularly are those Tiger teams. And those are ones that are broken down by those 7 categories below that 7 Tiger teams on the left corner there. We have an ecosystem use cases Tiger team, which look at what are the specific use cases within scalability challenges, across the ecosystem. We have one focused on identity, one focused on security, one focused on directory versioning and scale. We have one on exchange, one on certification and testing, and one on ultimately developing both pilots as a framework and how do you test things at scale when the solutions are developed, as well as eventually potentially advising on executing those pilots. And each one of those has anywhere from 8 on the low end to about 15, 16 members on the high end, and they meet about every 2 weeks. And they come together. Those are subject matter experts in those areas with diverse representation of stakeholder perspectives. And every 2 weeks, they're coming together and working on the solutions. First, they had to work on identifying the problems, the challenges, both from a regulatory and a technical standpoint, the challenges and barriers in their areas. And then they pivoted to working on the solutions. And they kind of own those and spend the time, developing those and incorporating feedback at a later date. Sometimes they meet more regularly than 2 weeks when they need to. For instance, if we had a deadline, sometimes they meet a little less regularly if they don't have anything to work on, or if we have something disrupt us like COVID, for instance. But those are the ones who meet the most often, aside from our chief architects, which Patrick is one of those. The next level up would be our coordinating committee. And our coordinating committee is really the original group that came together and approached ONC about getting this whole thing launched. They developed the initial charter. They developed kind of like the identification of this Tiger teams and what were the core problem areas that we need to focus on from an infrastructure standpoint. And then that initial draft list of technical challenges and barriers that the Tiger teams worked on. And we've got about 30 to 40 members in total that have been part of that group. In fact, Melanie Combs-Dyer, who I see is on this webinar, when she was with CMS, was part of that initial coordinating committee and drafting that charter from the get-go. So really appreciate her time and effort of getting us launched and being engaged, and then as well as bringing other CMS representatives to participate in this effort. And then continuing to be part of the conversation today. And then at the next level up, and the coordinating committee meets monthly, and they get updates on the work the 7 Tiger teams are doing, and kind of set some guidance direction. The chief architects will then take back feedback from the coordinating committee and work closely with the Tiger teams on developing their solutions and so on. And then the next highest level is that executive steering committee. They meet about 4 or 5 times a year. And this is the C-level executives from all the participating organizations that have people involved at the coordinating and committee and Tiger team level. And so, for instance, Patrick has a boss who needs to give him cover and tell him it's okay to work on this stuff and be a chief architect and be a member of our coordinating committee. And so his boss sits on that executive steering committee, or one of his.
Okay, it looks like we're having a little bandwidth issues. So, Stefan, if you're hearing us, we're not hearing you. So maybe Patrick, you might pick up the
Yeah, I can.
apple here.
Sure, I can go ahead and fill in for Stefan. Can you hear me okay, Daniel?
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah, so as Stefan was so eloquently talking about my boss, what that really means is that we certainly have these working teams. You know, the Tiger teams, I think there was a really good question in the chat, are basically focus groups. They're typically made up of subject matter experts, for example, as it relates to identity, security, exchange, and those types of things. So we have 7 of those very much focused. We have the coordinating committee, which
I think Stefan is back, Patrick.
Oh, okay.
You're back?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, can you guys hear me okay now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so as Patrick was, starting to pivot us to, the executive steering committee, they do meet, 4 or 5 times a year. It gives us that cover. But those are the ones who all meet regularly. The technical learning community is everybody else in the world who should be part of this work, the group that we really want to kind of keep up to date on this as we go along. People who don't have time or didn't get selected to be part of a Tiger team, but don't have time to participate in meetings on a regular basis, but maybe want to just kind of follow along and track the work as it's happening, and then choose to get more engaged at a later date, or just help bring the materials back to their organization, ensure that they're well positioned, share feedback on the solutions as they're getting drafted and worked on. It's just that broader community, much like the NIC is, where it's kind of a broader community of individuals that we can keep educated, engaged, and get solicit feedback from. And we do that engagement with the technical learning community in a number of ways. We've got, through the website, we publish as much material on there that we can and keep it all transparent. We do have webinars from time to time. I referenced some of the TLC webinars we did last fall, where we first shared kind of the early drafts of our solutions and got feedback, and those sessions were great. We, put out newsletter, email blasts, TLC meetings. Sometimes we would have those in conjunction with large conferences like a HIMSS or something, but for now, those are kind of on hold. And then we've got a LinkedIn group with a little over 400 members that have signed up to be part of that LinkedIn group. And I really encourage all of you to do that, because we cross-post all that material, and we have something new to update. We will also post it on there and make it easy for you to share with others. Next slide, please. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you some more links and details on how to actually sign up to be part of the TLC, as well as volunteer to be part of a Tiger team if you feel like you'd be a good fit for it. So one of the biggest questions we get, and I wanted to clarify this before we dive in, because if not, you'll probably start to get a lot of questions in your head about, well, how does this differ from Da Vinci, which we heard about a few weeks ago, or the Argonaut project, or Karen, or all these other collaborative efforts that are going on that in some way either focus on FHIR adoption solely, or at least it's part of their portfolio. So this is our best attempt to try to clarify where FAST sits in this broader picture of people who are working on FHIR-based solutions. And that hopefully will give you some good context and position you well to go through Patrick's presentation. So on the left-hand side, as Patrick was mentioning earlier in our brief talk that we had before this call started, you've got a lot of organizations, and there's actually 3 examples there. HL7 now has official FHIR accelerators that they call, including Codex and the Gravity project, which I know is also featured. and then you've got DaVinci. They all work on what we call functional use cases. And another way of saying that is a specific data for a specific purpose. Right? Prior authorization is one that DaVinci is working on, for instance. And each of them have a little bit different focus on like who their core consumers are, right? So DaVinci is really payers and providers working together for sharing data between them, and they're doing it for the purposes of achieving greater data sharing around value-based care use cases, or things that will help them advance to value-based care. The Argonaut project is provider to provider primarily, and sharing data as two endpoints, and they're looking at core data services. And then the Karen Alliance is really, their focus is all around empowering the consumer and consumer data sharing. And those FHIR consumer solutions are you know, kind of unique to what Karen works on. And there's a lot of other collaborative efforts. You got the Sequoia project in general, IHE, but those are all working on really what we call these functional use cases, or specific data for a specific purpose. Now in the middle, there's a lot of shared kind of technical challenges that come up to then scaling those solutions that are on the left. So in other words, if you come up with a implementation guide around prior authorization, for instance, under DaVinci, that's great, and it's out there for somebody else to adopt. But as everybody goes to try to deploy that and adopt it and implement that guide and follow it, there's a lot of technical challenges that they end up, and sometimes regulatory challenges that they end up running into, when people don't do these things the same way. So for instance, the fact that many organizations you know, still use different approaches for patient and provider identity management for the directory services, and I don't mean directory as it relates to identifying a physician and you know, where's that physician at, but really what is the FHIR endpoint? So having a directory of those specific FHIR endpoints and not having a single location to go for that. Version identification, how do you keep up with the different versionings of these implementations and so on. Scale, exchange process metadata, testing, conformance, and then security. So these are scalability challenges, because as everything on the left tries to deal with those issues, it slows down the widespread adoption on the right, ultimately. And so FAST is one of the ones that we know that is working on all of those. There may be others that address, you know, individual aspects of those. So for instance, Daniel, I know you had a webinar not too long ago looking at identity, and that's great. But we look at them kind of in context of each other as well at times. And we call these infrastructure use cases, and that's how they kind of differ, because we're looking at that core infrastructure, and there's some great graphics that Patrick will take us through to make it even more understandable. So ultimately, what we're hoping to do is come up with common scalability approaches that'll make all the things on the left much easier to be adopted at scale throughout the industry. All right, so with that, let's go to the next slide. I think we got the next poll here, and then after that, I'll turn it over to Patrick. So what is your familiarity with FHIR, and what is your organization's status on FHIR? You can launch those polls. So if this is your first real exposure, if you're pretty familiar with it, you get the concepts. If you're very familiar with it, you feel real confident in it. And if FHIR is part of your daily job, then you click that last one under expert. You're working on that all the time. You think it's your middle name. The second question, what is your status on FHIR? So if you're an organization that would either need to connect to or provide a FHIR API or work with developing FHIR-enabled APIs, consider that as you fill these out. And after we see the poll results here, when Mike thinks we've got enough response, then I'll go ahead and turn it over to Patrick.
And I must say, Stefan, I'm very excited to see these results coming in.
Yeah. Yeah, I see some comments about there being a non-applicable element there. Again, if you don't have an answer there, please feel free to just list that in the chat feature.
Okay, sharing results.
Perfect. All right, so we've got some that this is their first exposure. Okay, that's good. So for you, you're going to get a great little primer here. Familiar with the FHIR concept, so about half. So that's really beneficial. We think that you'll be easy to dive right in. And then the last 30% are very familiar or are experts. So it's a pretty good response here. And again, for the 22% at the top there, we think this will be really valuable for you. And again, since this is recorded and you'll have the slides, feel free to pass it along to others on your team that you think this would be valuable for. And then as far as the status, it looks like a certain percent don't use it, don't see any reason. About half, probably the same half that are very familiar with it and get the concept. It looks like a dead similar response there. See the benefit and plan to move in that direction. And then that about 43% are looking at using FHIR or already firing it today in a live environment. It's actually encouraging for ONC's perspective to see a plus 20% that are on this call running FHIR today in a live environment. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Patrick, if you can go ahead and take it away. He's one of our chief architects for the FHIR Scale Task Force. Patrick.
All right, thank you, Stefan. That was a great setup about the the history and the purpose and the meaning of FHIR. So I certainly appreciate that. And before I jump in, I do want to quickly thank again the Stewards of Change Institute and the NEC for having Stefan and I here today. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to come talk about FAST. As you can probably tell, we are passionate about interoperability, so we appreciate the opportunity to come talk about FAST, take some questions, have some conversations, and go from there. We also appreciate the fact that this is a difficult time for everybody on the call. So we certainly take, great pride in realizing that you've taken a few minutes out of your day to come listen to our conversation today. So next slide, please. And I do note in the poll that we had quite a few folks that are actually using FHIR. I think we had 10% in which FHIR is their middle name. So that's really, really cool. But we do need to set a baseline. So I'm going to take a few minutes to walk through some of the basics of APIs and FHIR so that we can all have the same level of understanding as we get further along in the use cases. Now, if you're a very advanced FHIR user or you have a PhD in computer science, then you might find some of my basic definitions of APIs and FHIR a little bit demeaning. Please don't take it that way. I'm simply trying to set a baseline so that as we get into the use cases and the patient journey, the terms that I'm using make sense to folks, right? And the first one we're going to talk about is an API. And APIs in today's world almost take on a mystical proportion because everybody talks about APIs from the guy in the computer lab all the way up to our CEOs and our other leaders in the organization, right? In the sense that APIs have become very, very popular. Now, I'm not sure that everybody that's talking about APIs fully understands what they are, but that's cool because really an API for the purpose of what we're going to go through today is nothing more than a little piece of computer software that allows two apps or two computers or two servers or two systems to talk to each other, right? That's basically what it means. So if you break APIs down to the basic elemental capability, it's getting information from point A to point B or requesting information from point B back to point A, right? That's what an API is. Some other features to keep in mind that APIs typically operate at a fairly small level, meaning they typically are good enough to get information about patients or medications or a financial transaction or whatever the case may be. So as opposed to these ginormous documents, these are typically broken into what we call Lego blocks of data. So not only are they able to serve up information, you're also able to put them together to create even more complex things. That's why we like to call them the Lego blocks of data, right? Because individually, they're very powerful. Putting them together or orchestrating them makes them even more powerful, right? Now, I'm going to give you a quick example because most folks on the call today work in healthcare, right? A lot of them in very technical areas of healthcare based upon the poll. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the way that APIs have enabled certain industries and how we want to take that learning and use it in healthcare. And I'll use the example of online shopping, right? I don't know if you're like me, but typically when we're not in a work at home environment, when I'm going to the office, I typically buy my clothes walking from my car to my office in the morning, right? My socks, right? And it's typically 3 clicks: color, size, buy on this device, right? 3 clicks. It's a very easy experience. It usually takes me about 45 seconds. Since I typically only buy gray socks, it's even a quicker experience, right? Now, under the covers, that was a completely API-enabled experience. The Amazon site, checked with my bank to make sure I had $14 to pay for the socks. So that was an API interaction. I didn't log into my bank to make sure. The API also talked to UPS or FedEx or the United States Postal Service to make sure that they could get it to me in 48 hours because I have, Prime Shopping. And there was also an API call over to the warehouse to make sure those socks were in stock so they could get to me in 2 days. So what was a very, very intuitive, easy experience for me was enabled by APIs. Now, compare that and contrast that to what happens in healthcare. Hopefully most folks on the session today are somewhat familiar with prior authorization, but if you're not, substitute any non-optimized healthcare workflow in which we use fax machines and phone calls, and we log into web portals and stuff like that. That experience is not what we call an API happy experience. The shopping one is. What we're trying to do from an API perspective is use that same type of contemporary technology and bring it to healthcare and allow it to run at scale. Next slide, please. Again, just to set some foundation, we've talked a little bit about what an API is. Hope you have a foundational understanding at this point. And I'll give you a very basic definition, or at least a couple of definitions of FHIR, because again, FHIR is one of those very popular terms in today's world in which folks, from the computer department all the way through the executive suites in leadership areas are talking about FHIR. And that's great because FHIR is a great enabler. It allows us to do things in healthcare that we were not able to do with previous generations of technology. But what really is FHIR? And I could talk about this for 3 days, but since I only have like 25 seconds for this slide, FHIR is nothing more than an API that we use for healthcare that has a nice, robust data model behind it. At the basic level, that's what FHIR is. Now, why is that important? And that's important because when we're talking about integration at scale, the ability to use a predefined, voted on, agreed upon standard across the industry is key, right? The fact that we have defined what a patient is. We've defined what a medication looks like. We've defined what an observation or a communication event, and the list goes on and on. There's 147 other types. But since those are all agreed upon, our ability to integrate is much more quick, right? We can do it more quickly because we're not renegotiating what a patient looks like or what a medication looks like. We are all agreeing to the standards. And since we're using contemporary API technology, you're able to connect those systems together much quicker than we could in the past, right? So that's where FHIR becomes a key element. Again, FHIR, an API with an agreed upon consensus-based data model behind it, right? So, and you see this very colorful picture on the right side, is that we have a lot of different actors in healthcare, right? We've got providers, we got referral specialists, we got public health, we've got payers, we got a lot of different organizations. And if we all agree on the same formats and what the definitions of our APIs are, the onboarding to each other is much quicker because we're not negotiating by the ones, right? We've agreed what the API looks like, we've agreed what the data format looks like, and we're able to share information. Now, one more quick thing before I move forward, because I don't want to underestimate this, because you're going to hear it throughout the presentation, is the thing that one of the big attributes of what FHIR does, it allows us to take data and put it in the right place, in the right workflow, for the right person at the right time. So that's key, the fact that we're able to use these APIs to serve up information in workflow where it's needed. We want to keep our clinicians, we want to keep our clinical operators, others in their native workflow and share information and interact with folks where they feel most comfortable, right? In their primary workflows. Next slide, please. Okay, so we frequently get this question, right? Why now? Why is FHIR and FAST and some of the other initiatives taking so much ground so quickly over the last couple of years? Because let's be transparent with each other. The abrasions and the suboptimal integrations that we have in healthcare didn't start magically a couple of years ago. They've existed for a long time, right? But what I like to call the inflection point is something that's come about over the last couple of years. I'm going to go through a couple of key items. I'm not going to go into detail on each one of these, I assure you. But we have a couple of things, both from a technical perspective, a government perspective, a market perspective, and a cooperation perspective that's enabling this inflection point. The first is the technology, right? So we've got a FHIR API model, which is based upon contemporary technology, which is rapidly being adopted by the industry, right? As a matter of fact, It is, called out in the CMS and the O&C final rules. We've got Da Vinci, we've got Argonaut, we've got Karen, we've got Gravity, a lot of other HL7 accelerators. So the fact that FHIR is becoming the de facto standard for clinical integration or clinical interoperability is a key factor. The other things are the operational drivers. The fact that as an industry, we recognize that our ability to share data with the appropriate consent and the appropriate security is key to success, right? I'm talking about success of patients, providers, and everybody else that helps drive healthcare forward, right? You've got to share information and make it available when the people who need it need it. The fact that, CMS and ONC, right? We've talked about the fact that Stefan is an ONC representative. I come from the private side, but we're working together with a bunch of our peers because we all recognize that as an industry, we've got to come together. We've got the technology, we've got the operational drivers, and now we've got the consortiums. And the last big piece that I have in there, I think, is, I call it value-based care, but there could be other, drivers as well. The fact that not only is it obvious that we need to share data, it is with value-based care arrangements, the fact that it is difficult to achieve success, right, from an outcomes perspective is obvious, right? So folks that may have been reticent to understand why sharing of information was so key now recognize that to achieve success for their patients, their members, whatever, we have to share data. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to quickly go through this. I think at this time, most folks are probably very familiar with the CMS and ONC rules, but I'm going to distill down, almost 1,000 pages of documentation into really 5 key points, because I want you to think about these as we start looking at the patient journey and some of the subsequent slides that we're going to go through, right? The fact that the rules clearly call out that members are going to be empowered, right? So what I like to call this device is a personal health information exchange in a pocket, right? Because with consumer mediation, I can share information across the ecosystem without the two entities having to negotiate contracts or agree on proprietary formats, right? I can click a button, and if it's a certified application with the appropriate consent and appropriate security, I can require that my information be shared. The second and third key thing is on the right side over there. The standards based in the open APIs are, again, another critical factor. The rules clearly state that version 4 of FHIR will be, or is, I should say, the protocol that we're going to use to share information. Again, another driver towards this open interoperability. The fourth one there, the care coordination across payers and providers, meaning that the rules mandate that as patients move through the healthcare ecosystem, their data should go with them, right? And we have a technology now that allows us to do that. So FHIR, consumer mediation, open APIs, allows care coordination across the spectrum. And the fifth one is one that we tend to occasionally gets glossed over, but it's very, very important. The fact that innovation helps move things forward. We've seen it in other industries. The fact that if you allow folks to innovate, again, with the appropriate consent and the appropriate security, things typically become better. People come up with ideas, new ways of doing things enters the marketplace. And with FHIR and this type of technology, innovation on an API framework becomes much easier. Next slide, please. All right, so this is one of my, I've got several favorite slides, during the presentation today here, but this is one of my, one of the ones that I like to talk about, right? Not only is it colorful and very simple, but it really drives the point home. And Stefan and Daniel earlier in the conversation talked about, some of the other initiatives that have presented to this group. I think Da Vinci, Gravity, several others were on the docket before. And those groups come up with use cases, right? And I'm part of all of those, so I'm very familiar with them, but they come up with very good use cases for this new technology, right? And they're functional in nature, meaning they're talking about prior authorization, they're talking about cross-transparency, they're talking about quality measures, things that are very functional from a day-to-day basis. As you're looking at this screen, think about the bus, the motor scooter, the red van, and the car as those functional use cases, right? The things that we need to solve in healthcare. We need to make prior auth better. We need to have cross transparency. Those are the vehicles. Now the roads, let's look at the roads here. If you look at it, they actually work because you can get to the left and to the right on this picture. The problem is everybody's built their own road. So the blue car, he's got a road going from the hospital on the right to the clinic on the left. Yeah, that kind of works, but wow, the motor scooter's got their own road and the bus has got its own road. So this works at small scale. But when you've got a lot of entities, and we've only got 2 on here, and it's starting to hurt my eyes a little bit, when you've got thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of different entities, this model becomes unworkable. So think of the cars, trucks, motor scooters as the functional use cases. Think of FAST as the group that's focusing on the infrastructure, the roadway in the middle. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at this picture, we've actually got the same vehicles, right? We got the same motor scooters, cars, trucks, and a bus, right? But it's much more orderly because they're all sharing infrastructure. So data and those functional use cases, you know, Da Vinci, Argonaut, Gravity, Karen, whatever, are going from left to right. So the vehicles are going back and forth, but they're sharing a roadway. And we've got a stoplight, right? And we've got lines in the road so that folks know where to go and which side to be on. We've got off ramps. So again, the underlying goals of the functional use cases doesn't change. The infrastructure enables it to run at scale. You know, in a nutshell, this picture is almost the essence of FAST because it allows the infrastructure, or it demonstrates the infrastructure for those use cases going back and forth. Next slide, please. All right, so now we've got a poll, right? And I like polls, and I'm going to prod people until we get a really, really good response. But how familiar are you with the challenges of clinical healthcare data exchange at scale? So the first response would be not much, meaning that you're just not familiar with healthcare data exchange or you haven't experienced it at scale. The second one is you know there are issues, but they really don't impact you on your daily life, or not that you're aware of. And the third one is you live in and breathe these painful challenges every day. So I suspect we're probably going to get some visceral reactions potentially to some folks who work in healthcare on a daily basis. But please, we really like to get this feedback because it allows us to dynamically provide content as we're going through the document or going through the presentation. As I'm seeing feedback, I will adjust at what level I'm going to, and then it really, really helps. So let's be interactive. All right, I'm going to cast my vote.
Last call.
Yeah, come on, people. Let's vote. Let's make it interactive. I get very offended if people don't vote during the polls. So
Well,
please.
some people are purely on phones, so they can't, they have trouble voting. But
Okay.
yeah,
Do we have a way to do this via telepathy? Can they just think real hard about it?
All right, we're getting down to the nitty gritty here. Last couple. All right, thank you.
All right, let's see our results here. Okay, those are pretty good, pretty responses. About what I would expect, actually. So not much, 23%. 34% recognize their issues, but maybe don't see them on a daily basis. 42% are the folks that live it and breathe it on a daily basis. So really, really good spectrum. So very nice. Thank you for voting on that. Okay, why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, now we're going to get into the meat of the conversation here. And transparently, guys, this is a lot of content. So I'm going to keep a fairly steady space, but you're going to see the information tends to repeat itself, right? So as we're talking about the solutions and we're talking about the approach, don't get too bogged down on one specific thing because there will be other opportunities at the end, or we can always come back or deal with it offline. If we could go back one slide, please, that'd be great. Yeah, I just want to talk through this because I like these slides because these people don't have any smiles on their faces, and I want to hone in on that, right? So as we talk about the patient journey, right, in today's world, we're going to set up a patient journey, and you pick the scenario. I'm going to talk about a patient or a patient visiting their PCP after hospitalization, and they need to get information from their payer. But if there's another particular use case that's near and dear to your heart, just pin it in here. But in this case, let's look at this. Very simple picture, but we've got our patient on the left side. We'll call her Laura, and she is at her primary care physician. He's obviously got a very robust EHR in the middle there because it's got graphs and heartbeats and all kinds of stuff. So it's working very, very well. And he's trying to share information with the specialist on the right side, right? Now, if we look, I know that we probably have some younger folks on the phone here today, but that device underneath in the middle, kind of at the bottom, is a fax machine. Many of you probably have not ever heard of one of these. I'm being slightly sarcastic, but the fact that you walk over to a device and you actually fax something, or you make a phone call. That's why these people have frowns on their face, is because they're leaving their workflow. They're going somewhere else to try to get information to do their day-to-day job. Okay, they're not smiling. Next slide, please. In a world in which we have FHIR and other associated technologies, we were able to share information electronically exactly when it's needed. So you notice we have the same actors. We got the patient, the two physicians, PCP on the left, and a specialist on the right, and information is being shared via FHIR, via EHRs. So information is flowing and is made available exactly when it's needed. And please note, these people have smiles on their face. So different scenario entirely. Now, I know this is very almost childish, the way I'm describing it here, but as we go through the more advanced use case, in which we're going to break it down into individual sections, I should say, please keep this in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, now we saw on the previous slide that we had smiling faces and they were sharing information, but now we're back to how do you do this at scale? Remember, FAST is concerned with FHIR at scale. How do we make it work across the ecosystem? Not just point-to-point communication, but how do you connect all of the actors in healthcare in a way that's dynamic, easy to use, and allows the flow of information? Now, in this model, again, they're not smiling because they don't have FAST, right? They're doing point-to-point communication, which means the folks on the left and the folks on the right need to understand how to interact with each other. What is your endpoint? What does your FHIR server look like? You know, let's do that type of thing. Which, again, I'm not saying it doesn't work, but it doesn't allow quick, seamless integration when you're dealing with really, really large number of folks, right? Or large number of actors. In reality, most of us that are using FHIR today, and there was a whole lot on that previous screen, are using a model similar to this, where you had knowledge, either via a phone call or an email or whatever, of what the FHIR address was for your partner. And you've configured that somewhere in a configuration file in your EHR system, in your API management framework, whatever the case may be. Somewhere you've configured that. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to get into an actual journey. And again, this slide can be, it's going to get complex towards the end, but we're going to break it down and go through it what we call a build deck, you know, a portion at a time. So go ahead and click the next button once. And again, I'm going to talk about a patient at our PCP needing information from the payer, right? It could be, do we need prior authorization? It could be, does this patient have coverage? It could be, do you have special coding requirements? It could be, do you have lab results? It could be any of those use cases that come from Argonaut, that come from DaVinci, that come from Karen, that come from Gravity. You substitute whichever one you want there. It doesn't matter. The underlying interoperability is the same. So in this case, we've got a PCP that needs information from a payer. So go ahead and click one forward. And we've got two systems, right? We've got a requesting system and a receiving system. So in this case, it's typically going to be an EHR, right? That's going to request it from a payer system. We're going to assume they're using FHIR because we're talking about FHIR on the conversation today. It could be a CDS hook. It could be some other complementary type of technology. But for the most part, we're talking about a FHIR integration. Next slide, please. In this case, the requesting system needs to understand how to interact with the payer system, right? Now, in today's world, as we saw on the previous slide, that may mean that you had to have had some pre-knowledge of what the URL was for the endpoint on the receiving system. You know, you've got to understand how to talk to that. That works at low scale. It doesn't work at high scale. So if you go ahead and click next, what we're proposing, or with the model we're looking at, go ahead and go to the next slide, please, is that we have the ability to find endpoints dynamically. So just like you're using your web browser to find whatever addresses you want, you don't necessarily have to know the IP address when you're communicating with a web server. Similar here is that we have basically a national directory in which you can interact with that and get the validated endpoints of any other actor in the system. Next slide, please. One more. There we go. Okay, and then we've got exchange, right? We know that in the world of exchange, things can be point to point, but things can also need to go over intermediaries or clearinghouses that we have in healthcare. And the fact that the individual transaction must have enough information so that it can get to point A to point B, or point A, from this case, the PCP to the payer, using information that's inside of the transaction, because it may go across an intermediary, may go across a clearinghouse, whatever the case may be. So the fact that we need to reliably make sure messages have enough information to gather themselves is critical. Next slide, please. One more. The next one is conformance and certification. There you go. The fact that in this world, all of the actors need to understand that all of the other actors are playing at the same level, right? And they've gone through some level of conformance validation and certification. So this line at the bottom here, I'm pointing at my screen, you obviously can't see that, where it says conformance and certification means that across the spectrum, there are testing facilities and ways for you to vouch or certify that you have tested and you're able to play in the brave new world of this type of interoperability. Next slide, please. One more. Versioning, right? One of my personal favorites. Now this got a little bit easier with the final rule in the sense that we all know that version 4 is the standard for FHIR for CMS. That doesn't mean we're all going to abandon our previous versions of FHIR, of course, and it doesn't mean that new versions of FHIR are not going to come out. So the fact that not only do you need to understand where the endpoints are for one of your actors without making a phone call to them, you need to be able to get that electronically. You also need to understand what version of FHIR they're supporting so that you're interacting with them at a version level that they can support, and you're also putting all the exchange metadata in there so that it's routed in the appropriate format. Next slide, please. One more. All right, identity, right? And this is always a big one. The fact that, you know, classically in the world of healthcare, we all relied on our own identifiers for, not exclusively, but typically when we built, you know, different types of identity models or PICs or PDQs, whatever, the fact that we were typically relying on one of our own IDs or a known ID across the healthcare spectrum was kind of a given. But in the brave new world of interoperability, again, facilitated with mobile devices and consumer mediation, you can't always rely on getting your own identifier. And payers are probably, you know, the most guilty of this. And historically saying, if you want to interact with us, and I'm a payer, it's okay for me to say that. If you want to interact with me, you have to give me one of my own IDs. That model is going to come under pressure as we're doing consumer mediated exchange. So the ability for all of us to agree on identity matching is critical. Next slide, please. All right, and then we've got security. Again, it's noted at the bottom, right? The challenge is, how do we know, how are we going to authenticate and authorize, right? Because we all know that healthcare information is of the utmost sensitivity. So we've got to be able to make sure that people who are interacting with your data, first of all, we know that they can authenticate that they are somebody that actually needs to see the data. And then we can authorize for a certain set of data depending upon the context, right? You could be a PCP by day, you could be a caregiver by night, you could moonlight at the ER on the weekends, right? Whatever. Depending upon the context, you'll get access to certain information once you are authenticated. Next slide, please. And then, of course, in part number 6, and we went pretty quickly there, 6, we're basically getting the information back. Now, I know I threw a lot of information to you guys really, really quickly. We're gonna hit on this again in a different set of slides and kind of reinforce it. But keep in mind, these are the types of things that FAST is concerned with. We're not concerned with the individual content of the transaction. We're concerned, or we're focused on making sure that the transactions run at scale using the appropriate security, identity, exchange metadata, and certification. And of course, we also have pilots at the bottom. I'm not going to talk about a whole lot about pilots today. You'll probably hear about those more over the next couple of months, but basically just piloting between partners in the ecosystem to make sure that we can share using these models. Next slide, please. Okay. For some reason, that's a little bit low on my screen here, but bottom line is, when we first started FAST, and Stefan did a great job of describing this a little while ago, we knew there were certain things that we needed to focus on. We talked about directory services. We talked about identity. We talked about security, testing and performance, version, and scaling. So those were the key things that we focused on. We created use cases to make sure that we understood what we thought were the barriers. And for the most part, we've come out, most of our hypotheses were validated, that these were the things that we needed to focus on. Now, the graphic in of itself is very nice, but I think in the interest of time, I know we're getting pretty close here. Let's go ahead and go forward because I want to kind of recycle again through those barriers and maybe reinforce that a little bit. Next slide, please. All right, and I think, you know, Stefan did a great job of covering this previously, but we'll go ahead and walk through it really, really quickly. The way that we come up with solutions, right? We've got ecosystem use cases, meaning that these are use cases that come from the world of clinical operations, the world of population health, from a payer perspective, CMS, whatever the case may be. And we create these use cases to kind of pressure test things that we know are happening from an interoperability perspective. Out of those, we derive a couple of things: technical barriers, like identity, directory, things that we talked about a second ago. And then we frame up what are the core capabilities? What features does FAST need to provide to help mitigate the barriers to scale, right? Core capabilities are, you know, basically identity, endpoint discovery, security. You know, a lot of the Tiger teams, the names that you have on the Tiger teams actually result in core capabilities. We have about 15 of those. Payer resolution, patient identity, those things. Go ahead and go next. So out of the box on the left side, the Tiger teams, as we discussed earlier, industry experts that really focus on one thing, you know, identity, security, ecosystem, directory, and then they come up with proposed infrastructure solutions, right? This is a proposed solution for helping the industry with that problem. Next slide. And from that, it goes into what Stefan described earlier, and the fact that we have Tiger team, or we have TLCs, we have subject matter experts, things that allow us to pressure test it. So end of last year, we did a bunch of work, you know, with webinars and talking about our solutions. Some of you may have been involved in it, in which we actually walked through these, got feedback, and did some changes. From those proposed infrastructure solutions, we will come up with recommended infrastructure solutions. We're still not 100% there yet. And those could be recommendation to standards and also to process and regulation. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have evaluation and feedback, and we haven't even talked about the operational solutions, but these documents will also have operational recommendations as well. Next slide. And I know we're really close on time, so I'm going to go pretty quickly here. I think we've covered the meat of it. The presentation is meant to reinforce, so keep going. Go ahead and we'll just kind of keep going until we got a lot of data on here. We've talked about, you know, the solutions a little bit. I walked through it during the patient journey. I'm going to quickly hit on those again. The fact that from a directory perspective, how do we find other endpoints, validated FHIR endpoints, right? The proposed solution is basically a national validated FHIR endpoint repository in which you can interact with that, provide some credentials, provide some demographic information for who you're wanting to interact with, or which facility or payer you want to interact with, and you get the data back, or you get the endpoint back, not the data. From a versioning perspective, that we know that we're going to have to support multiple versions of FHIR, and the fact that the directory will probably tell you what version of FHIR an endpoint supports is a really, really good thing. From a scale perspective, we kind of like to frame this up as the fact that we know that we're going to have intermediaries in a hybrid model. And the fact that at scale, you've got to be able to hop those intermediaries and provide a lot of information, or not a lot of information, the metadata to allow the transaction to flow. So the bottom line is if you do all the other stuff is, you know, the versions, directory, security, identity, then you're going to get scale. Identity perspective is go ahead and keep going forward, is making sure that we can do patient matching across entities in healthcare. Again, like we talked about earlier, it was mostly predicated on our own identifiers in the past. In the brave new world, we've got to be able to interrupt without requiring that everybody understand our identifier. An exchange process, go ahead and go next, basically is a solution in which we ensure that the individual FHIR transactions have enough metadata to route across, you know, different intermediaries. From a testing and certification perspective, we're basically ensuring that we have a protocol and a reliable mechanism for folks to onboard and be able to present credentials that they can play in the FAST world. And then from a security perspective, the fact that we know that we can use OAuth 2, OID Connect, other types of technologies. Dynamic client registration is one that we're working on, so that things can dynamically register as well, and so that we can manage permissions, across the spectrum, and have very high reliability and fidelity that people that are authenticating or should be authenticating and authorizing for certain levels of data. Next slide, please. All right, so keep going. I'm going to go through these really, really quickly because I've said it at least twice now. Again, this is Stephen and I like to reinforce things because we both have really bad memories. But the fact that we've talked about from a directory perspective, a national solution for FHIR endpoint discovery. It's almost, for those who are familiar with web type stuff, it's almost a DNS for clinical endpoints. Multiple production versions of FHIR, I think that's a given. FHIR RESTful exchange across intermediaries. We all know that clearinghouses and intermediaries bring a lot of value add. So the fact that we need to have enough routing information in the transaction to make that happen is key. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think we talked about this when I covered this on reliable routing with metadata across intermediaries. That basically means the transaction has enough information of the sender and the receiver so that it's guaranteed delivery. Next slide. Mediated patient matching, and basically I could spend 3 hours on this one, but the fact that there are several options in place about patient matching, collaborative, distributed identity management, which is a hot topic right now. The group is actively looking at all of these, and we'll be making, along with the peers in the industry, some recommendations on that. Next slide. Dynamic client registration, authentication, and authorization. I touched on this a couple of slides ago. That basically means at runtime, those folks that are already authorized and certified using a certificate are able to present that credential and start playing in or start interacting with other partners without there being foreknowledge of that partnership, right? So the partnerships are forged based upon trust at runtime. Next slide. And of course, the FHIR testing and certification, again, that basically means that we've got an ability to test and certify that folks that say they're able to do FHIR at scale are able to do FHIR at scale. Next slide. I think this is just kind of a recap of everything that I've mentioned, so I'm not going to read it to you a fourth time, I promise. So if we could go one more slide. And now quickly go through this, as far as the regulatory barriers, and then I'll kick it back over to Stefan. Some of the things that we consider as we're going through this, the fact that we need to keep in mind the HIPAA minimum necessary model. Of course, we don't want to lose focus on that. The single name standard, the fact that in previous versions of interoperability, HIPAA or X12 was mandated or other standards. We keep that in focus as well. That HIPAA transactions require X12. So those of us that play in the X12 world, in the HIPAA world, realize those transactions are here. And FHIR can be complementary and actually help make X12 go better if you're supplying other information using other transaction sets. So not meant to replace X12, meant to be complementary. Use of NPES as a repository for endpoints. That's what I talked about a few minutes ago with the directory, the national directory. The patient identifier, of course, is a key thing. Data blocking, which we're all actively and acutely aware of given the recent rules. Next slide, please. And I think we've got one more poll before I kick it back over. Do these barriers and evolving solutions seem on track? So we presented 2 years worth of material in less than 45 minutes. Hopefully you've been able to digest it. So please feel free to answer that poll. The first one is yes or mostly. I think FAST is adjusting the key issues. And the second one is somewhat or not. I think many of the issues are covered, but there are certainly others. And if you could, in the interest of time, I want to give Stefan a few minutes to close out and also do some Q&A. Please, if you could go ahead and answer those questions, then we can move right along. As I said before, I love to talk about this stuff, so I tend to really push the time barrier, so I apologize. So Daniel or Mike, do we have good polling response?
Getting there. Give it another minute. I think that should get us there, maybe 30
Start
seconds.
looking at the chat session here.
Okay, it's slowing down. We'll make this the last call, last 15 seconds.
Let's make it count, folks. Let's make it count. I think this is our last poll.
All right, that looks to be about it. Thank you. Sharing results.
All right, so good results in 81%. Think we're pretty much in line, and 19% somewhat or no. So that's good feedback. If there are things that you think we're missing, I encourage you to put them in the poll or the chat box, and so we can address those and maybe take those offline. I'm not sure we have time to talk about them today. With that said, Stefan, I've given you very precious time left to close it out.
No worries. Thank you, Patrick. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can.
Great. All right. So I'm going to fly through these last slides to reserve some time for Q&A. And we'll also have our contact information. If you want to, if we don't get enough time for your questions, just put them in the chat feature, or you can email us directly afterwards. All right. So next slide. We're going to go through these quickly. In closing, we just wanted to mention that FAST, there are several ways that this supports our overarching ONC goals. It's making sure that we're connecting healthcare and health data through this national interoperable health IT infrastructure, something we've been working on since our inception. We are focused keenly under this administration. We have definitely been more focused on working to reduce the regulatory administrative burden related to the use of health IT, including EHRs, and have a whole number of work groups around this, and this work tries to complement that. And ONC is also working on ways to give clinicians more time to focus on what matters, which is really caring for those patients. And all of these statements come from the bottom supporting documents. We have links to those, the ONC Cures Act Final Interoperability Rule. We have a whole, I'm going to share some more links on the next page for that, as well as some of our report on a strategy for reducing burden related to the use of health IT and EHRs. And then our 2020 through 2025 Federal Health IT Strategic Plan, there's a link to that as well, which the public comment period was extended, but just ended about 2 weeks ago. So stay tuned for the final version of that to come out. Next slide. And again, just can't emphasize enough, we're really proud with the work that we've done around the final rule for ONC, CMS also on their final rule as it relates to supporting interoperability. Part of the reason why we are so focused on FHIR is because it is, specifically referenced in our final rule, and in some cases, there's a requirement to use aspects of FHIR. So, and as it relates to our certification programs and so on. So that's why it's important we have this infrastructure addressed at scale to be able to support solutions, because they're going to be required to use FHIR going forward. And so when it comes to the rule, if you want to learn more about that, there's the center URL, and then there's a lot of direct links to our fact sheets that break down different aspects of it around information blocking, certification, updates to the certification aspects of certifying health IT. And we've got webinars, we've broken down even more detail, blog posts, et cetera. So feel free to access all those for more information. Next slide. And again, these are direct links just to speed up. You can go to the bottom tiny URL link to take you to the main page. I put some of them in the chat feature as well. A great place to start if you want to go back and if this didn't quite connect on today's presentation, you can also go to the FAST end of year report, and we try to walk through and have a lot of hyperlinks in that end of year report. I did put that in the chat feature as well. But these are just direct hyperlinks. So these materials, along with today's presentation and the recording, are all going to be posted on the next site. So I encourage you to go there and get all of these materials and follow up later. Next slide. And then again, we break it down to a lot of content. So we have artifacts around, specifically just the technical barriers, explaining those in detail, the regulatory barriers, explaining those in detail, and then each solution, we've got entire, documents that go down to great detail on a lot of these. So today was a very high level overview, even though it was a lot of content, but know that there's even more meat on the bones as you start to go through some of our artifacts. Okay, next slide. And so we'll get there. And that's the end of year report, just to make it easier. Go ahead and skip right through that again. I think lastly, we might just have our contact information. This is where you can sign up for the LinkedIn group to either volunteer to participate. You have to fill out an application, kind of says what your expertise is, why you think you're a good fit. But to join the LinkedIn group, anybody can do that. There is no application process. it just puts you in a queue. We review to make sure you're not a Russian bot or some kind of other a fake account. But otherwise, we accept pretty much everybody who wants to follow along in the LinkedIn group. And it's great to have peer-to-peer communication through that as well. All right, and so now we'll do some questions. And I think we do have our contact information. Feel free to transition to that slide if you want, just in case people want to write down our email address and follow up with us offline. But otherwise, we can shift right to the questions right now. Maybe leave this slide up.
So thanks, Stefan and Patrick, for a great, just a really wonderful overview. I know how challenging it is to put years of work into one slide presentation. So I think the good news here is that we've got a lot of stuff to be able to follow up with and to be able to work on. Obviously there's a lot of questions. I think that there will be a lot of questions. So I'm going to invite you both to join us on the NIC Hub for some questions that'll come back, and maybe grab some of your time to address some of them. I'm going to ask one question. I know others from the NIC have already expressed on here, and this is probably a larger question, and we probably won't have a lot of time to get into it, but this certainly lays out a framework and an architecture and an approach and a model and standard for health exchange, pharmacy exchange, clinical data, which we all will certainly benefit from over time. But one of the things that we're clearly focused on here within the NIC, as I said at the start, was how to integrate and how to share data between not only the healthcare world, but the other parts of the universe that are needing some select healthcare information to do their jobs, whether or not it's foster care, home-based services, behavioral health, education, public safety. And so the whole question that we've been grappling with now for months is, how can we, and what's the way to be able to leverage and use and integrate the FHIR work that's happening in all these different functional areas, as well as FAST, into the human services domain? And is there a place for alignment there? So we know that there's other standards out there that are being used now extensively in some other areas. How do we bring those together? And is there a role for that? And how do you guys think about that from within the FHIR and the healthcare world?
So Stefan, I'll take a first cut at it, and you can certainly chime in. So I think that's a really, really good point. And given the fact that that I think, obviously the primary focus was integrating healthcare, initially with FHIR and stuff like that. And that has been, heads down, our blinders on for a couple of years. But over, the last year or so, especially with some of the gravity work, and unfortunately also with some of the stuff that's happened with COVID-19, I think it's starting to be obvious that occasionally we have to go out of the healthcare ecosystem, right? In the sense that folks that we need to interact with, for example, to do analytics, at a geographic region, may require that you have information from, health services organizations or whatever that may not be considered classic clinical entities, right? So even in the last couple of months, we've actually used some FHIR type of transactions to bridge some of those gaps, and have put thought into, do we need to go back to the FHIR community and say, we focused on what we're doing from a healthcare perspective, and some of these APIs are usable outside of the healthcare specific domain, but should we perhaps start thinking about broadening that so that those complementary type of functions that live around healthcare can start sharing information as well? I think we're only in the beginning of that journey, but I think the light has clicked on. Stefan?
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to consider is that, this is just one piece of ONC's approach to try to address, interoperability and data sharing amongst, all stakeholders, really. And obviously, this health IT certification program and EHRs have been, and HIEs have been a key component and focus area for ONC from the start. And that was when there was, less than 10% of the industry actually was using an electronic health record in any format. And we, greatly subsidized and enforced in some cases the adoption of health IT records over the last decade plus. And now we're at a point where you've got 98+% or so that do have access to a digital health record and do have the capability for that. We know that the public health and human service side has been one that's fallen a little bit behind in that initial focus area, and the HIEs play some role there in bringing them along. Partially because of the resources that have been constrained for them, but we're always continuing to figure out how to get more paper information into digital formats, and then therefore make it possible to be interoperable with the rest of the healthcare ecosystem. The transition to value-based care as a market force as well, with CMS and others leading that, and working with private payers as well. I can tell you firsthand that Humana and other organizations are, keenly in the trenches working on figuring out how to share data and collect additional data between their provider partners in a more efficient manner. And when you look at that transition to value-based care, it looks at more of those human services and social settings as well. And certainly with CMS being involved, it's going to touch on a lot of those. So we believe in the promise of FHIR, and I've been pushing on it because it is an open sourced, type of technology. It relies upon an API ecosystem, which we've been pushing for years since our early days working on Smart on FHIR with Boston Children's Hospitals and others. And FAST is just trying to make sure that that infrastructure is there. So as things are being developed, and you are seeing more and more of these accelerators getting launched under HL7 to focus on specific domain areas, demographic areas, like Gravity is with social determinants of health, that anybody can spin up and focus on the areas they want, and then they can quickly be deployed because we've addressed the infrastructure barriers in a uniform way that anybody could take advantage of. So I think the biggest challenge would be the technical skill and the capacity to build, the resources available at the human service level to gain the knowledge of how to leverage APIs and to learn about FHIR. And so I think it's great that Stewards of Change is helping educate many of the partners around that, and we'll continue to try to develop as many resources as we can that'll be free and available for our partners to use on the human services side as well from ONC. So that's my thoughts just for kind of like a big picture transition. The worlds have been blending. They've human service and private side of healthcare have largely, when it comes to interoperability, worked in parallel paths. And Daniel and I have talked about this over the past several years, where we knew that the transition to value-based care is kind of forcing those two worlds to merge in ways that they haven't traditionally before, so that you're hearing these interoperability discussions happen in greater context between those entities than we ever have before.
So I will thank you, Stefan. And I know we've had that. We have been working, and I'll say we, encompassing all of the domains in parallel efforts. And I think you're right that COVID has certainly spotted, sort of shining a spotlight on it, as has the opioid crisis, as have natural disasters. So I think it's time that we sort of try to bridge those. I know we've been having conversations with lots of folks at ONC to do that. And what I think I'd like to do is, obviously, we're at time now, and I see people still hanging around, so we're happy to stick on around for a couple more minutes. I know people have busy schedules, but what I like to do is I like to invite you guys back into this kind of conversation that we want to have with human services, education, public safety, healthcare, and actually have a roundtable online and talk about ways to do that. Because I think, as I said at the start of this call, one of the things we're really trying to do is through this action agenda is to have that conversation broadly to figure out how we can accelerate that. And that won't happen in a parallel track. That has to happen crossing those domains. So I'll put that out there now. We can certainly talk more about it offline about it. And I will also ask you guys to come onto the NIC Hub, and as we pose a couple of questions, and we'll summarize some of the key points from today and put that up there. As people have conversations, it's a good place to have that conversation. We'll join you on the LinkedIn site and our LinkedIn site as well. But I think it's a great start to, or a great continuation of the conversations that are happening. And I think that as value-based care happens and as social determinants moves forward, there'll be more and more interest in making that happen. So I want to again thank you for that. And if you guys have a few more minutes, that's great. If not, we'll schedule some more time for that interactive conversation.
Agree.
Okay, that sounds great. The as Michael has been sort of running through some of the upcoming webinars, I think these will actually present some opportunities, especially next week as we talk about it, and the next couple of weeks. But we'll design a specific one to actually have this specific conversation as we go forward over the next several months, and really look forward to your participation in that. So with that, any final words?
No, I just really want to thank you for providing the platform for us to share this with your group. We really do want this to be something that is workable for all stakeholders, no matter what domain they come from. And it's really just focused on, if it's fire related, and if it's dealing with those infrastructure use cases, those challenges that everybody kind of currently has different approaches for, that's what we're trying to standardize and come up with those common scalability approaches to letting fire solutions, be deployed quickly and adopted widely. And really want to encourage you to, figure out whichever engagement method works best for you. If it's through the NIC group and you want to continue to stay that path, that's great. If you want to directly reach out and get more involved in FAST, that's great. You can do it through the TLC if you want to kind of monitor and then figure out when to get more engaged. You just want to hand it off to somebody else to monitor. If you want to email us directly, our emails are there. All of this, we really try to make this as fair and accessible of an open process as we can. So any feedback you have, feel free to share with us in whatever means you feel most comfortable.
I want to just put one other thing on the table, which is something we've talked about for a while, and now there's a resurgence around that, which is there's a number of different domains that are involved and have been for many years on the National Information Exchange Model, or NIEM. And NIEM is really representing in many ways, public safety, emergency medical, census, child welfare, adoption in areas, and many areas that are actually very deeply engaged and have mapped very much many of the same resources within the NIEM domain. We need to map those things because those systems I don't think are going to fundamentally shift over to FHIR. So we need to figure out, I think, a way that we can blend those two things so we can really take advantage of those that are already operating within another national standard. And that's a conversation we've been having for a long time on the NIC here. How that happens, where that happens, I think ONC would be a great contributor to that conversation to sort of rationally think about if or how that can actually happen in an expedited fashion.
That's a great point.
Excellent, great. Well, we'll ring that bell a little bit more as we go forward. And so our contact information is up here. I want to again thank you guys for joining us on the call here. We'll be back with you, and I think have a great weekend, folks. Stay safe, and thanks for joining. Thanks for making time in your day to join us here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.